Or it's a dream. Okay. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, a returning guest. His name is John Klyczek. We talked earlier this month, August 2022, about his excellent book, carrying on kind of a tradition of critique of American school system. Title of that book we talked about is School World Order, the Technocratic Globalization of Corporatized Education. When we were talking, and I was reading through his bio, he said he really had a expertise on a book, very important book, and actually me rereading it through, I saw so many things that apply to today's world. But very important book, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, however you want to pronounce that. But written, I think, published 31, 32. He was fairly young, like in his 30s, and it just showed a lot of knowledge, and he was very prescient on a number of things. But John can talk more about that. So, John Klyczek, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. So, for people who may not have heard our last show, and I will put a link to that in the notes, can you kind of talk a little bit about your bio and what got you interested in becoming an expert in this book, Brave New World?
Yeah, so my bio, I teach college rhetoric, done it for about 10 years now. Wrote a few articles on the education system, on the corporatization of it and the technology aspects. Hooked up with Charlotte Thompson Iserbyt, who wrote the foreword to my book, helped me get my contract with Chris Milligan. And the Brave New World stuff, I actually I studied that before I really got into sort of, I guess, this what you might call the New World Order research in my book. And it was actually given to me by a friend of mine. He had a copy of it, and I just grabbed it one day. I didn't read it till later in my bachelor's degree. But it was at a time when I had sort of started looking into, some of these more, I guess we might use the pejorative conspiratorial, theories about society. And ever since I've taught it with my English 102 research argumentation and rhetoric class. So basically, we read the novel as something that's sort of entertaining. It gives them sort of a history on a lot of the technology that's basically now sort of, being implemented. So that's sort of my expertise has been teaching it and, having a dialogue about it, several times a year for many years, the last couple of years, because of online, I haven't been able to have those discussions. So it's not as fresh as it usually is, but that's sort of, how there was actually going to be a chapter where I was going to sort of do an analysis of Brave New World and tie it into the book, but it just became, the book became its own thing. It became really big. And so eventually I think I have some quotes here that I can pull from Huxley's nonfiction that eventually maybe that will be a book.
Oh, interesting. So like for people who may not know who Huxley was, he was an important grandson of one of, was Darwin's bulldog with the same last name. So his family knew eugenics, social engineering, kind of racial sensibilities. Can you kind of talk about Aldous Huxley and his brother, and then kind of the background, what probably influenced the information in this book?
Yeah. So it's so Thomas Henry Huxley is his grandfather. Okay. And he's the guy that's known as Darwin's bulldog because Darwin wasn't really big on public speaking. So it's really T.H. Huxley who popularizes Darwinism. And, I've often said in some ways, you could in some ways call it Huxleyanism as much as you can call it Darwinism, because it just wouldn't have become as popular if it weren't for T.H. Huxley. And interestingly, actually, I don't know if a lot of people know, but, the Darwins weren't just into, so Galton's cousin is the guy that comes up with the idea of eugenics. And it's right. He basically looks at Darwin's theories of evolution and natural selection and says, well, we can sort of harness this and we can steer it and we can sort of basically control evolution through what he called positive and negative eugenics. So positive is the inbreeding of the elites. And the negative eugenics is basically culling what they call the unfit, right? So that was eventually became through sterilization, abortion, euthanasia, etc. But the Darwins and the Galtons and also the Wedgwoods, they didn't just, this wasn't a theory. They actually tried to put it into action. And at the first World International Conference on Eugenics, there's a they actually displayed, and you can find it online, the family tree of the Darwin Galton Wedgwood line. But in there, and not as integral, is the Huxleys, right? And so Charles Galton Darwin, who wrote I think it's The Next Million Years, or something like that, in around the 60s, he actually has some Huxley lineage in him as well. So they actually, were tight in that way. And so that's where a lot of the eugenics theories sort of get pulled into, largely the first chapter of Brave New World, but there's other ways that you can see them in here and there sprinkled throughout the novel. Aldous' brother was Julian Huxley, and he was actually the first director general of UNESCO. And there's an infamous quote in UNESCO, Its Purpose and Its Philosophy, and it says something to the effect of basically, Hitler got it wrong with race hygiene. We don't want to be focused on specific races, but we do want to focus on specific genetic and phenotypic qualities. And the quote is something to the effect of, at some point, we need to make the unthinkable thinkable again, meaning eugenics. So he's basically calling for a global eugenics program. And he also called a lot for, Malthusian population control, which is sort of the flip side of the eugenics coin. And so basically Malthusianism is about the quantity of your human species, and the eugenics is about the quality. But actually Darwin himself got the idea of natural selection from Malthus's theory. So Malthus's idea was that there's a limited amount of resources, and that basically there's always competition for these resources. And it's basically from that idea that Darwin figures, okay, it's because we have limited resources that we have a competition of species, and whoever wins that competition gains some genetic advantage, and then that gets passed down, and that's how we evolve. So it's all really part of the same milieu of what becomes modern biology and genetics. It's interesting to note the thing about Julian, though, because another aspect of Brave New World is the world state, right? So his brother is basically, he's the head of a global governance institution. I mean, not quite a world state, right? But it's a global governance institution, and he's calling for global eugenics, and he calls for an optimum population size in there as well. So both of those aspects that are in the novel, they were enacted by his brother.
Right. So he's aware of what's going on. Huxley is aware of these kind of things happening, right?
Yeah. So, yeah. And I should also note his brother was a president of the British Eugenics Society.
Right. So this is all kind of its eugenics, and that's put in this first chapter. This is before the discovery of DNA, right? So what is it? Crick and whatever discovered it in the late 40s. So it's pretty remarkable that he put that together really in that first chapter, that whole thing, the Buchanovsky process and this kind of hatchery. And they're looking to stabilize, right? So at the very beginning, this world controllers want stability. That's one of the three things. Can you kind of talk about that first chapter?
Yeah. So in the first chapter, basically what you get is sort of the building the plot and the setting. And you basically, there's it's not the world controller. He comes in and out the third chapter. It's I think he's the director of hatchery and conditioning. And so there's these students going through, and they're being given a tour of basically these factories where they breed various human beings into different castes, and they do it on an assembly line model, and they do it basically in test tubes. Okay, and that idea actually comes from JBS Haldane, and I believe he was a member of the Royal Society, if my memory serves me. And there's a book called, I think it's Daedalus, or maybe it might be an article or an essay that he did, but he basically posits this idea of basically artificial reproduction, and there's an interesting article as well, and these are all his nonfiction books back here.
Interesting. And the first test tube baby isn't until like 78 or 80 or something like that. So these are all very predictive.
Yeah. And what you also get in there is, there's also a big play on Plato's Republic in the first chapter as well, right? And so for Plato, basically had a proto-eugenic theory about caste breeding, and his idea was that in the perfect utopian republic, that you would have philosopher kings that would basically run everything, and they would be of the gold caste or the gold breed. And then under them, you would have silver, which is basically your soldiers. And then after that, you'd have your bronze. And that's, I think what he says, something to the effect of husbandmen. And it's basically your laborers, your agricultural workers. And what Huxley kind of does in the first chapter is he sort of mixes it with the Hindu caste system. I think it's about 4 castes, I think. So it's alpha, beta, delta, gamma, epsilon. Okay, so it's 5. And is, what a lot of people, they read the novel largely as sort of a warning or a critique. But if you read Aldous Huxley's nonfiction articles, and his background and his family, at best it's sort of a dark comedy, sort of tongue in cheek, right? And he's sort of poking at industrialists basically getting in charge of this system, as opposed to the philosopher kings, or to use the analogy in Brave New World, the philosopher kings are the scientists, basically, right? And so if there's any critique in there, it's pretty much just that that he thinks that it should be in the hands of these what he actually called an intellectual aristocracy, rather than corporatists. And but as far as eugenics and the caste system and the population control, that's all stuff that he actually espoused. And there's a few quotes I can actually read you from his nonfiction here. So
Please do.
So there's an essay or an article he did in 1927 called "The Future of the Past." And in this piece, he says, the sciences of psychology and genetics have yielded results which confirm the doubts inspired by practical experience. We no longer believe in equality and perfectibility. We know that nurture cannot alter nature. In the future that we envisage, eugenics will be practiced in order to improve the human breed, and society will be organized as a hierarchy of mental quality, and the form of government will be aristocratic, and that term comes out of the Republic, in the literal sense of the world. That is to say, the best will rule. Aristos means the best. Our children may look forward to the establishment of a new caste system based on differences in natural ability. And then there's another one in 1931. This is on the charms of history and the future of the past, replaying his title here. Basically, he says, contemporary prophets have visions of future societies founded on the idea of natural inequality. They look forward to the reestablishment on a new and much more realistic foundation of the old hierarchies. They have visions of a ruling aristocracy and of a race slowly improved by deliberate eugenic breeding. He adds that we can imagine our children having visions of a new caste system based on differences in native ability and accompanied by a Machiavellian system of education designed to give the members of the lower castes only such instruction as it is profitable for society at large, and the upper castes in particular that they should have. And then we've got a promotional speech that he gave for Brave New World. This was called Science and Civilization. And this is sort of where he's critiquing some of the industrialist factor and what would be this new planned economy. But he basically is suggesting here that they would also need to not just produce, the elite gold caste, but he quotes stupid people, right? Quote unquote. And he says here, so these eugenics would be, quote, accompanied by the special breeding and training of small caste of experts without whom a scientific civilization cannot exist. In a scientific civilization, society must be organized on a caste basis. The rulers and their advisory experts will be a kind of Brahmins controlling vast hordes of the intellectual equivalents of Sudras and untouchables. So Brahmins are the highest caste in the Hindu caste system. The Sudras are known as the untouchables. They're at the bottom. And then there's one more quote that is most telling here that I'll taught you, and that is the one where he says, here it is. This is in a letter to J. Glynn Roberts, and he says, quote, about 99.5% of the entire population of the planet are as stupid and Philistine as the great masses of the English. The important thing, it seems to me, is not to attack the 99.5%, but to try to see that the 0.5% survives, keeps its quality up to the highest possible level, and, if possible, dominates the rest. The imbecility of the 99.5% is appalling, but after all, what else can you expect? So I mean, that's just, and there's a lot more than that, but that's a nice overview of
Huxley's outlook, right? He's the aristocracy. So when he's saying an aristocracy, he's talking about himself. Like, I mean, he was educated at Eton, taught Orwell, so like very literary on, you know, fiction and nonfiction. I don't remember how many books he wrote, but it, you know,
quite a few, right? I mean, like I said, I mean, you're looking at all of his essays he wrote here. It's about this thick, right? It's 7 volumes, right? So, I mean, that doesn't include his novels, right?
And he was very similar to Orwell, very tall. Like there was like a left-wing historian named Hobsbawm. He said that the aristocrats of England were very different than the lower classes. They were all taller because they had access to more resources and other things like that. So Orwell was by nature, like, and nurture, he was aristocratic in outlook. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and he was literally part of what they call the intellectual aristocracy. So they weren't like the part of the nobility proper, but they were the intellectual. So see, they were sort of like right in there, right? I mean, you might call it like an upper middle class, but very close to the Royal Society, and a lot of them were part of the Royal Society.
Right. So they weren't like a titled landed elite, right?
No, not like that. But I mean, like the Wedgwoods were extremely wealthy. You know, they were definitely well-to-do. But yeah, just not in that royal bloodline, so to speak. No.
And so, in this first chapter, Huxley is writing the maintenance of this caste system would be done in the test tube, so that the alphas would get the best stuff, and then literally the lower caste would be given alcohol or something to stunt their progress from the test tube, right?
Yeah. Some of them, they added alcohol to make them cognitively disinclined so that they would be, you know, efficient for whatever lower caste they're supposed to be in. And then they did things. So they also were breeding not just for your intellectual grade, but each of those intellectual grades was affiliated with a workforce role. And so some of them, they did stuff like if they had to work in the mines or something, they would subject the vials to heat. Somehow that was going to condition them to be working in hot conditions and stuff like that. So it was also, right, I mean, so also what you get in chapter 1 is basically a layout of basically the planned economy, the planned economic system, which, you know, with its heavy emphasis on the corporate angle and the industrialism, you know, you could look at it definitely as a type of fascism. But if you look at some of the character names, right, and some of them are like minor characters or kind of throwaway characters, but you know, the names that each of these characters have alludes to basically this new history of the brave new world, right? So there's a new denotation in terms of the year, right? So we're at AD or CE, however you want to talk about it, right? And then so after the world state is formed, then we're at AF in the novel, and that's the year after Ford. Okay, and so they basically make Ford more or less a deity. So instead of making the sign of the cross, they make the sign of the T, like the Model T, and they'll say things like "Our Ford" instead of "Our Lord," or "Oh Ford" instead of "Oh Lord." Right. So there's definitely like sort of this corporate fascist dimension to it. But characters like Bernard Marx, well, that's an allusion to George Bernard Shaw and Karl Marx, right? George Bernard Shaw was a Fabian socialist. Marx is obviously the founder of communism. Then you have one of the love interests, Lenina Crown. Well, her first name is an allusion to Vladimir Lenin, right? And so, in other words, the names that these people have, the only surnames that have survived, they're not Christian surnames. All the surnames do, right?
Pauly Trotsky, right? Pauly Trotsky was one.
Yeah.
I was noticing that.
Yeah. And so basically that, you know, that's indicating that, you know, Huxley actually wants some sort of a combination of basically the fascist and the communist flavors of totalitarianism. And I actually have another quote here that I can read you where he says this much. And this is 1927. This is one of his nonfiction pieces. This is The Outlook for American Culture, Some Reflections in a Machine Age. And the quote says, "With regard to political democracy, its disadvantages are becoming daily more apparent in America as in all other countries which have adopted it as a system of government. The revolt against political democracy has already begun in Europe and is obviously destined to spread. There will be no return to autocracy. Of course, government will tend to be concentrated in the hands of intelligent and active oligarchs. The ideal state is one in which there is a material democracy controlled by an aristocracy of intellect. The active and intelligent oligarchies of the ideal state do not yet exist, but the fascist party in Italy, the communist party in Russia, the Kuomintang in China are still their inadequate precursors. So he's telling you right there that whatever this aristocratic, scientifically controlled dictatorship is going to be some mixture of basically all those pilots.
Right. So this is what the Brave New World is this whole syncretism or whatever hybrid of this worldview, right? And they're talking about that they had a 9-year war, so they're really trying to go in with community identity stability. That's really what they're trying to have.
Yeah, that's what triggers the creation of the world state, right? It's the 9 years war, and then also the great economic collapse. And what do we have, just a few years after, right? I mean, we have the Great Depression and we have World War II. Obviously, we already had World War I, but I mean, he's basically, alluding to, again, stuff that historically comes to pass. It was either him or Julian, might have been both, was also part of what was known as the Planning Society in England. So they were having a lot of economic problems, and there was people that were not necessarily socialist, maybe labor in orientation. You had others, that were fascist leaning as well, but there was a lot of just intellectuals that figured that the way out of this growing depression was some sort of centralized planning, right? And they didn't necessarily want to call it socialism, communism, fascism, but they agreed, these people that were in these planning councils, that basically, what we might call free market today was not the way out.
Right. It was really interesting. And one of the fascinating aspects, and shows how intelligent he was the whole integration of Pavlov and the hypnopedia. Like, for me, that sounds so current. This whole, I'm going to just bombard you with this conditioning over and over. I thought that was a fascinating aspect. I think he brought that up in the second chapter.
The second chapter. So the first chapter is all about the eugenics. It's all about the biology. That's basically where they're in the hatcheries. And then the second chapter, they take that tour of students up to the conditioning centers, the neo-Pavlovian conditioning centers, right? And Pavlov, was just basically, the Russian counterpart to Wilhelm Wundt, right? And so, people can go back and check out our last interview, but I dug pretty deep into the history of stimulus response conditioning, behaviorist conditioning, and operant conditioning in the American school system, all coming out of Leipzig, Germany, out of Wilhelm Wundt. But Pavlov basically comes out of that same circle there, right? And he just sort of brings it over to the Soviets, who in many ways, they were more into the conditioning than they were into the eugenics, because it just lined up with communist theory better, right? Like for the communists, right, the idea was that the reason why people are exploited has to do with the social conditions. In other words, the political economic paradigm. So if you can just rearrange that properly, everybody could basically carry their weight, as opposed to, a more biological outview that basically suggested that the reason why people are poor is because of their biology. It's not, any way you restructure the economy isn't going to fix it, right? So they were more into it. But what the second chapter also focuses on, and this gets back to my book, it's the education centers as well, right? And so in these neo-Pavlovian conditioning centers, they bring these kids out, and the lower caste that are just supposed to be good little worker bees, they don't want them to read. They don't want them, because they don't want them to think too much, because they don't want them to become dissatisfied with their workforce caste. And then they also didn't want them to spend too much time like just out in nature. So they lay out these books, and they lay out these flowers, and then they have these babies crawl towards the flowers and the books. And once they get pretty close to it, they electrocute the babies, and then they set off these explosions, right? Just loud booms to scare the babies, and then to obviously inflict physical pain upon them, so that they will associate those traumatic experiences with nature and reading, and that would forever condition them or reinforce the biological engineering the first chapter with this social conditioning. And that's basically, again, that is education psychology in a nutshell. They're not electrocuting people, but it's the idea of conditioning children to have responses to particular stimuli. And you can actually think of that chapter as basically a little Albert experiment on a grand scale. So I may or may not have touched on the little Albert experiment when we did our last show.
I don't recall that. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So a guy by the name of John B. Watson, he's the guy that coins the term behaviorism. He's actually a student of John Dewey. John Dewey is a student of G. Stanley Hall. G. Stanley Hall is a student of Wilhelm Wundt. So it comes straight out of that tradition. And there's actually a character. He's one of the main characters in the novel. His name is Helmholtz Watson. And that's a German scientist by the name of Hermann von Helmholtz. Is the first name, and the last name is an allusion to John B. Watson. And what John B. Watson did in the little Albert experiment was they wanted to see if they could condition this little boy to be scared of rabbits. Okay. And so what they did was they basically the same thing. They put the baby out, they bring the little rabbit, and then they would like bang hammers and do things to scare the baby and otherwise traumatize the baby. And eventually what the conditioning was so strong that he was scared of anything that was white and furry for the rest of his life. And if you just put a rabbit mask on, just like a plastic mask, he would be scared of that as well. And, they never did decondition the child. This is, I guess, before they had any sort of an ethics board in the realm of psychological, laboratories, but that's basically what that is. It's taking his little Albert experiment and just, sort of mass producing it.
Wow. So he has that in there. Then he has like the psychic driving. You're going to get these phrases over and over and over again. Oh, all through their life. So he has that ideal society is being propagandized with these state. Really, it's not almost propaganda. It's almost like a mind control. Like you're constantly getting messages at night while you sleep, right?
Yeah. So when they're sleeping, they get sort of a recorder just repeats these slogans for their cast, right? And it was something to the effect of like, man, I'm so glad I'm a beta because those alphas are so smart and they work so hard. And I'm glad I don't have to work that hard, but I'm glad I'm at a delta because those people are so stupid, right? And so those are the types of things that they would do to reinforce their place in their cast. And then they had to wear uniforms with particular colors, right? And one other thing that we would note is interesting about the cast is that they're very subtle, but if you read it, the way he describes the lower castes, sometimes he'll use terms like brachycephalic, basically, right? He's describing sort of a stunted skull structure, which indicates, right, smaller brain growth. And, they're effectively phrenological terms. Phrenology was this science that basically was related to eugenics, that you could basically measure somebody's eugenic capabilities, their biological capabilities based on the shape of their skull. But with that, which you used the term psychic driving, right? I think that's one of those MK Ultra guys, right? Wasn't it Cameron or one of those
Cameron,
guys?
you and Cameron, they know.
Yeah. It very much is. It very much is that. And maybe when we get to chapter 4, we'll see some more of Huxley's sort of connections to some of the other strategies that were tried in some of those MK Ultra experiments, in particular the psychedelic stuff.
It's all behavioral control. That's what they're trying to do. Is all kinds of stuff that's in Brave New World. Brave New World precedes that by 20 years.
Yeah. And the interesting thing with the conditioning part, the Pavlovian, that is basically the behaviorist school of psychology. The other main school of psychology at the time was basically the Freudian or the psychoanalytic. And actually, there's a lot of Freudian analogies they use in there, and some of it has to do with the smash monogamy that takes place throughout the novel in terms of their abolition of the family and their mass promiscuity. But as far as the conditioning, the psychic driving, it's Freudian in the sense that it's the subconscious. Okay. And so you have to condition the conscious reflexes to the environment through the behaviorist method, but then you also need to condition the subconscious. And the story that they use in the second chapter, the way that they discovered it, was some little boy that fell asleep and he was listening to something on the radio, and it had something to do with how long the Nile was. And so when he woke up, he could repeat this. Okay, he could repeat all the words that he heard, but he didn't conceptually understand it. Right. And so they tried to, like, what they said was this was not good in terms of practical conditioning. What it was good for is what he called, quote, moral education. And so basically it's the a priori part of the thinking method, right? So in philosophy, you have a priori and a posteriori. A posteriori is basically knowledge comes after experience. That's basically your behaviorist conditioning, right? So your knowledge of how you want to respond to the environment comes after you experience these rewards or punishments. But before you ever come to any experience, right, we have certain assumptions that we have, these a priori, right, these ideas or this knowledge that we have prior to any experience. And so that's basically how you create what's now basically identity politics, right? And so before you have a reaction to the environmental stimuli, you're putting that into this a priori category of who I am in terms of the caste identity.
Right. It's really incredible. Like, some of these words are very they're very recent, you know, they're in use: identity politics, community, all this stuff. So it's almost like some of these concepts are still filtering around today. Like,
No, 100%. I mean, as I sort of mentioned in our last talk, just looking at some of the technologies, I mean, everything that we're seeing now, you know, the theoretical phases are at least 100 years old, right? I mean, so now we've gone through the phases of, you know, prototypes. I mean, we're pretty much just at the phase of sort of getting everything either commercialized or institutionalized.
And so then it develops from there. So he lays the groundwork in the 2 chapters of the whole social structure. And then he counterposes that to their trip, the trip of Lenina, and was it Bernard? They go out to the Savage Reservation, right? Can you talk about what happens next?
Yeah. So in that chapter, basically, one thing it shows is that, you know, there's this world state, right? Highly industrialized, scientifically controlled, but, you know, they go to what they call the Savage Reservation. So it suggests that basically you still have areas of, you know, that are basically in a more or less what you might call a third world state, right? And what they do there is they end up finding a guy by the name of John, and they refer to him as the Savage usually. And he's basically, so somebody else had taken a vacation there, and apparently she didn't have her Malthusian belt. Okay, so in chapter 3, what you also get is they all have to wear these Malthusian belts, and they're basically they dispense contraceptives. Okay, because they're not supposed to breed. The only reproduction that happens is in those vials. And, you know, it's particular type, particular quantities. They even do like basically a cloning method. They call it Volkanovsky's process, where, you know, so you have like 99 people that look at it. Not only do they act the same, but they look the same. I mean, they're pretty much just copies. And so I believe she was impregnated by, I think he's the director of hatcheries and conditioning. He's not the world controller, but he's high up in the hierarchy. And so she ends up having this baby there. And so this baby sort of grows up, you know, on this, you know, what they call the Savage Reservation. And he's exposed to sort of a hodgepodge of like indigenous spirituality, also the Bible, and then Shakespeare, right? So, and this is all stuff that's banned in the world state, right? So any classical literature, any concept of God, any concept of anything supernatural or spiritual, right? Everything to them is empirical. It can be scientifically measured and controlled. So for the rest of the novel, basically, so they're going to take him back And basically what they're doing is the world controller is basically running an experiment to see, and it sort of posits this nature nurture debate, and how does it work? And they're trying to see if they can get him acclimated back into the world state, right? Like, will he be able to adjust, assimilate, and conform? And by the end of the novel, we'll probably get there, but it doesn't work out, right? He ends up committing suicide.
That's how it ends. That's how the end of the book is. Yeah. And it is interesting because he can't adapt to these other people, and they look at him in a very strange manner, the way he responds. They study him like a behaviorist would study a human being. Like, oh, he has sympathy for his dying senile mother. This is so interesting. Wow. Whereas they would just zap people into the crematorium, right, and harvest their ashes for fertilizer, right? Like
yeah. And there's a scene there where I think it's Lennon and Bernard, or there's two people, and they're flying around their copter or driving around or something, and they drive past one of these smokestacks, and basically this is somewhere where they're processing basically the cremated bodies for whatever it is, for fertilizer or energy. And she basically says something to the effect of like, oh, isn't it great that we get to go on, contributing to the world state even after we're dead? And I might be mixing up scenes here, but I think that's the same scene where Bernard Marx goes, well, you're just saying that because you've been conditioned to say that. Like, Bernard Marx is this guy who, so he's an alpha, but he doesn't look like an alpha. And so the theory is that, there's like this rumor that somebody accidentally put a little bit of alcohol in his vial. And so because he is in the alpha caste, but is not actually an alpha in terms of his biology, or he basically, he sees things differently, right? He's in this conflicted space. So he questions things, right? And then sort of his foil is a guy I mentioned, Helmholtz Watson. He's sort of the opposite. He's an alpha, but he's like too alpha, right? And he's so alpha that like all these girls are constantly throwing themselves at him, and he doesn't want anything to do with it, right? He thinks it's basically all meaningless. And he's part of, I think, what it's called the emotional engineers or something like that. But he basically writes jingles and slogans to help with reinforced conditioning. But what he wants to do is write like poetry, right? He wants to like write something that actually means something in the grand scheme of the universe. And when John he brings him some Shakespeare, and he starts reading to him about love, romantic love, and family, all these things that are they're like basically 4-letter words in Brave New World, right? So when the director, or maybe it's the world controllers, at some point they're both in the tour, and basically they mention mothers and fathers, and the students are like, oh, he said mother, like, he said the F word or something, right? And when he brings this to Helmholtz, when he brings Shakespeare, he laughs. He's like, it's different, but he's like mothers and fathers. So, I mean, even his conditioning, he senses there's something more, but he can't get there.
And they have like Shakespeare and the Bible are in a safe. I think one of the world controllers has it in a safe. So like a lot of Fahrenheit 451 elements too, like it seems like. So it's like, yeah. And that's really what distinguishes the savage, which is an ironic term, from all these other test tube bred people, is that he's really thinking. He's thinking and referencing Shakespeare on these human events where these other people are just permanently happy all the time, dancing, being promiscuous, and taking drugs, right?
Yeah. And, so what that sort of shows us is that the world controllers, I think there's 10 of them, right? And I think that might be a biblical allusion, if my memory serves me correct, like an allusion to Revelation. But basically, they get to read all the illicit literature. They get to know the real history, right? They're privy to all of this information. And one thing that's interesting about the world controller that we learn is that even science isn't really science, right? And that's how he got to become the world controller, because basically he started doing some of his own science. Like he started doing his own experiments, trying to, figure things out on his own. And, Helmholtz says something like, well, you tell us that science is everything. He says, what you have, your version of science book is, he says, it's quote, a cookbook. In other words, right, you have a bunch of, equations and algorithms and things that are given to you, and then you just put in the data. Like, you're not actually figuring out new equations, new algorithms, right? Doing new experiments, right? And so that's, at that point, they give the world controller an option. It's like, okay, so you're pretty smart. You can either be a world controller, or we're going to exile you, which is where I think Bernard and Helmholtz wind up in the end. So, you know, there's a riot scene at the end that involves the Savage, and they take them, and they don't kill them. So I guess, you know, I mean, I guess it's more humane than 1984. But they do exile him, and when they exile Helmholtz, they says, well, where would you like to go? And he says, I'd like to go somewhere particularly cold, meaning, like, he has this intuition that if he's somewhere that's where that's not totally comfortable and convenient, that will inspire him to write this art, create this art that he's thinking about but can't get his head wrapped around.
And he's similar to the Savage too, because the Savage really wants to integrate all of the ups and downs of life. Like, I want to be. He makes these real forceful statements at the end, like, I claim them all, right? So he's much different than these constantly superficial, you know, you're not. And then in the Brave New World, these people who are in the caste systems, they're not supposed to have a wide emotional range at all. And if you step out of that narrow emotional range, people start asking questions, right? Like, why you do this? Why don't you just take some soma?
Yeah. That was that end debate between the world controller and John the Savage is one of the best parts of the novel, because it's sort of a rhetorical battle of, you know, the old world view and this Brave New World view. And he uses an analogy to sort of critique the world controller. And he says something like, you want to get rid of all the difficult things, right? And he uses this fable that the indigenous people used to teach him back when he was on the reservation. And I think it's called, like, the Girl of Matoski. And it's this fable about this young boy who wants to, you know, be courted to this girl. And to do it, he has to work in this field, garden or something, and he has to do it for however many days. But the whole time he's there, he's constantly being attacked by these mosquitoes or these flies or some pest they're constantly flying around him and biting him. And basically, he's saying you want to get rid of that stuff. But he's saying that that's what makes gives it meaning, right? I mean, because now it's not just that I got the girl that I like. It's that, you know, I went through this trial to do it, right? I mean, it's, you know, it's used sort of a cliche. It's the difference between climbing the mountain and having somebody, you know, drop you off on the top of it, right, with a plane or something, right? And that's throughout. You know, he's really interested in this other character, Lenina, and you know, she's conditioned, and so she just wants to get straight to the bedroom, right? And he's like, no, I have to do something. I have to earn it. Like, I have to do something great for you, something noble, and then we can do that. And then obviously he wants to be monogamous, which she doesn't. And so, you know, he's constantly pursuing her, and in the end, he ends up sleeping with her, and that's part of why he actually ends up killing himself, is because you know, he's ashamed at what he did. I think at first he that's before, and when he's flogging himself, but you know, he wakes up to this shame, and he ends up hanging himself, and that's the end of the novel.
Right, but there's some element of pain, like the flogging of him, people flogging him. There's something going on where they like to see this as a kind of circus event. Like, they can't understand why somebody would want to experience pain. So it's there. I think Huxley's trying to emphasize, like, how is it really that great to be in a pain-free environment? Maybe you need to have pain. Do you get that kind of sense from the book?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I definitely think that's the theme in there. And there's is it a preface or an afterword to one of the reprint editions? And basically, one of the things he says is that he shouldn't have killed off the Savage in the end. He should have found a way to get him to integrate. And I guess that's sort of him suggesting what we're getting at. But again, I mean, he's totally, just looking at the few quotes that we threw out there. I mean, he really wants the planned society. So I mean, at the end of the day, I don't know how, I don't know how those two things can exist for him, but definitely that idea is there in the book.
Right. And that's the whole thing. One of the things I took away was Lenina saying, yes, everybody's happy now. They had heard the words repeated 150 times every night for 12 years. Like they had to convince everybody they're happy. I mean, what do you think your chief takeaways from this book are?
Well, with the end kind of reminds me a little bit like the end of Space Odyssey 2001 in the sense that, David Bowman in the end, he basically, there's the sequel where he's some sort of ethereal star child, I mean, all that weird psychedelic stuff at the end. But I mean, one of the takeaways from it is that once humankind transitions to this next phase in evolution, that the old human being cannot exist, right? And so, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing as far as Huxley goes, I really think ultimately that his idea of a planned society, if he came across, sort of a dilemma where you got to pick one, right? Either we're gonna keep some of these old values, we're gonna have, some sort of the necessary struggles that you need to, to use a Maslowian term, to self-actualize. If that's one option and it can't be, synthesized with the planned society, that he'd be okay with getting rid of that and going with the planned society.
Right. I think that's interesting. So the savage represents the old way, can't adapt to this new way. But I also get the sense like this planned society is very shallow. Like there's not a lot of thinking or philosophy or, it's set music and weird kind of ritualized dancing and things like that. I kind of felt like they had those chants that they made, like we're 12 and 1 and 12, and just kind of creepy kind of elements to it. Do you think
that's an important chapter. That's an important chapter there. I think it's chapter 5, and that's basically where they're at the solidarity services, and basically it's sort of a humanistic spin on religion. And there's a novel that Julian Huxley wrote. It's called What Dare I Think? And largely what it deals with is, for him, the dilemma was basically there is this a priori, we might call it a spiritual side of the human psyche. Okay, now whether or not for Huxley believed that was actually connecting to something divine or something metaphysical, he couldn't deny that it was part of the psyche. And so there's something you have to do something with that part of the psyche. So you couldn't just abolish religion entirely. You'd have to replace it with something else. And in these religious ceremonies, basically what they do is they have an orgy. They take soma, which is basically some sort of a psychedelic / amphetamine. And through that, they experience what's called the greater being. Now, this is something on all the years I've read it and discussed it, I still don't know what to make of it, because clearly there's no God in this world and there's no heaven. So there's no indication that they believe in anything metaphysical or spiritual. So what is the greater being, right? I mean, like it sort of booms, or it sort of mics in as like, sort of the voice of Ford or something like that. But I mean, I wonder, is he suggesting that the greater being is just the collective and the greater collective experience that you get from the drugged out orgy? I mean, that seems most plausible. But
right, and there's no emphasis on individuality either in this. Maybe your caste system, but I think it is all collective. Like we're all working together as part of this caste system organization.
Yeah,
do you agree with that?
Yeah, one of the slogans that they use is everyone belongs to everyone else. Right. And there's no privacy. Like you're not supposed to be alone for any amount of time. Right. And and if you have anything that veering towards what could be a monogamous relationship, like that's no good. Right. Like, so I think it's Lenina, her friend Fanny, is like, you've been with the same guy for like a whole couple months or something. Like, the world controller or the director or whoever, they're not going to like that. Right. And what's interesting there is in that scene, they also, she's like, well, yeah, I'm going to have to get a pregnancy surrogate soon. So I guess the theory is that if they could basically flush the body with the hormones that you would experience during pregnancy, that would sort of recalibrate her and have her back focused on, sort of this smash monogamy sort of thing. What's else is kind of an interesting little note around that same scene is there's a reference to I think the girls were going to or just getting finished with a vibro vacuum massage, right? And basically, if you know the history of vibrators, they were psychological instruments at a time, right? So the term hysteria, right? This is, the root here, right? We're referring to hysterectomy, right? The idea of hysteria as a term, they thought it was basically just some problem of female biology, right? And so the vibrator came around when, if your wife was depressed or having hysteria around the house, you would take her to the doctor, the psychologist, and I guess, he's using a tool, so you can't, he's not actually, he's not
performing
intimate with your wife, but he's, he's performing this medical procedure. So, that's another.
That's where it all went back to. Yeah. Crazy. Do you have time for a few questions? We're about the 50-minute mark. I mean, really great discussion. There's a lot in this book, a lot going on. You can see why it's still important, why it's still referenced, I think. Because there's a lot of themes in there. Yeah. Oswald's asking, do you know if Huxley himself had Rh negative blue blood? Do you know what blue blood refers to?
I think what he's referring to is sort of what happened to a lot of the royal families after a lot of the inbreeding. I don't think he did, but he did have some issue with his eye, and I don't remember if it was congenital or not. He actually wanted to be either a doctor or something in the medical field or in science in particular, but his eyes got messed up, and so that's what led him into the literary sphere. But I can't say as far as
I thought the word blue blood comes because your skin is so light that you can see the blood pumping through it. That's where I heard that term comes from.
I think it has something to do with the guy asking the question. I think some of the and this is partially why the royal family was very interested in eugenics. It wasn't just for controlling the so-called unfit, but they had a lot of congenital issues that they wanted to figure out. Is it has something to do with our bloodlines or how we're breeding? So yeah.
Right. Oswald also asked, does Klyczek think Orwell was any less of a wolf in sheep's clothing than Huxley?
I kind of do. I like Orwell. I liked Orwell more, before I've sort of dug into it. But, with 1984, just like with Brave New World, the way that it ends, it doesn't give you very much hope at all. I mean, it's really basically like this is the future and there's nothing you can do about it. And if you think you're going to hold on to something from the past, you're not. And, the other thing with Orwell was that, he was a socialist, but he ratted on a lot of his socialist buddies.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
So Animal Farm is like an expose. It's not this version of socialism is not for me, is what he was. I think is what he was saying. He wasn't on board all the way.
Yeah.
He was really more of kind of sympathetic people person in my opinion. But
Yeah. I mean, he had his run-ins with Stalin during the, when he was with the loyalists, fighting Franco and all that. And so, he saw where that could go. And I mean, he remained a socialist all his life. And I like a lot of his analysis, of rhetoric and propaganda and stuff like that. But I just, with the way the novel turns out and knowing some of his background, I hate to say it, but yeah, because I always did like Orwell, but I think he probably was, not our guy.
Did you ever hear of a connection between Huxley and Barbara Marx Hubbard?
I haven't, and I just wrote a really long piece on Barbara Marx Hubbard. The best we could tie him to would be sort of tangentially through the human potential movement. Now that term is coined by Aldous Huxley, who is a big shot at the Esalen Institute. And this gets us back to something I wanted to touch on in chapter 5, which has to do with the pharmacology and the idea of soma, right? So So Huxley was really big in those psychedelic crowds. A lot of those guys at Esalen. I should have pulled that out. I didn't think of it. I have a book called High Priest by Timothy Leary. And it's an interesting, like, it's got like I Ching symbols and poems and essays, and it's a collection of essays. It's really odd, really psychedelic, just the layout in it. But in there he's quoting when he had one of his interactions with Huxley. And this book has nothing to do. It has to do with sort of, consciousness and spirituality and stuff. It has nothing to do with eugenics or Malthusianism. But he said that, Huxley was a really nice guy, except for when he would take these asides to rant about overpopulation. I mean, so he talked about it so much that this guy felt that it was necessary to note it in a text that has nothing to do with the topic.
They were connected in the 1960s, early 60s, 61. Huxley famously died the same day JFK died, and
which is the same day that C.S. Lewis died, the exact same day, same year as well. Yeah.
It's all kind of interesting because there's a lot of like mental, they all stripped. Huxley took LSD. C.S. Lewis went from an atheist to really one of the leading Christians of the 20th century, and then Kennedy.
Yeah, and you might be able to clarify this if my memory serves me. I know you got your book on Crowley. Crowley hung out with Huxley as well, didn't he?
Yes, there's actually Crowley painted his picture. It's in one of the showings that Crowley had in Weimar, Germany, and Berlin. It's listed there, but it's in a private collection. I don't know where it is, but I know that he hung out with Huxley. He was in that same group of these same guys. He was mixing in those same groups. So it's Christopher Isherwood, Krishnamurti, Huxley, and they all ended up in Los Angeles. Like they lived close to each other. Isherwood and Huxley lived close to each other in Hollywood, or not in Hollywood, in the kind of the West Side, I think, if I remember. And Krishnamurti ended up in Ojai. But there's a couple other guys I can't remember now, but they all knew each other. They were all very familiar. And I think that it became very unfashionable to know Crowley at a certain point. So I think Huxley kind of dropped his connection to him. But I think one of Huxley's books was Do Your Will. Do What You Will. I think that's the title of one of Huxley's books. It was Do What You Will or something. Okay. Very Crowleyan. Okay. I haven't read through it. But my understanding, there was also an allegation that Crowley really introduced mescaline to Huxley. Because Crowley was called anhelonium back in the day. They didn't have the name mescaline for it.
Okay.
But Huxley did mescaline before he got LSD. So Doors of Perception. Right?
Yeah, there you go. That's the one, right? Which is where the band The Doors gets their name, right? It's a spin on a Blake quote. Yeah. So yeah. And another
right. Well, Brave New World is from The Tempest. So this is also very profound. Like that, The Tempest too is like has very deep things going on. I mean, all Shakespeare really does. But it's interesting that he took it from Shakespeare, and then Shakespeare is an important part of this book, because it's kind of like that humanistic learning or something, and poetic sensibility.
Yeah, I mean, and we might mention, just the whole human potential movement. I mean, I sort of use that. I use that Maslowian terms about self-actualization through this pseudo spiritual ritual. I really think that's. I mean, he coined the term later, obviously, but I mean that. I think the sort of the germs of that idea are sort of, you can find them in that chapter, right? I mean, sort of, reaching your human potential through this collective, through psychedelics, right? And another interesting thing, a lot of people don't know, is that B.F. Skinner was, he gave speeches at Esalen as well. So you have the behavior school there, the humanistic psychology there, you have the Freudians, you have the psychedelic stuff.
Leary, Robert Anton Wilson. Yeah, you got so many people located there. And the background of that place is actually much more interesting. These guys were, Murphy started it. It was like in communication with Nine. Like people talk about the Nine with, not Gurdjieff, it's with, I can't remember his name, but these guys were in contact with higher beings, man. It's very strange. And all these other people. I think that Manson was at Esalen a week before the murders happened too. So Manson was, something like Manson was connected to it. John, we are at the 60-minute mark. Is there anything you'd like to add? Anything I missed? How do you want to wrap this up? Do you want to do an overview of your opinion on this book, and where can people find you, reach out to you, social media, etc.?
I think we covered a pretty good amount of it. We covered most of the important historical stuff. I mean, my last thoughts on it. I mean, and Reddit talked about it. Looked into it, researched. I really don't see it as as a warning against a dystopia. I really see it as sort of his tongue-in-cheek kind of dark comedic version of what he would ultimately like to see. And where people can find me, you can go to my website, that's schoolworldorder.info. And there's all my social medias on there. And, anything else where you want to support me is you can get all the links there.
Awesome. Yeah, really great talk. Thanks for sharing all that information too. It's really an important book, but I think you're right. I don't think it's a warning. This is more of like, this is kind of this world that we could be going into, and this old world, the savage world. We're getting rid of it. I mean, he wrote, what was the scientific revolution or whatever. So he knew about drugs and social engineering and stuff like that.
I mean, he was connected to the people that were working on it. He was into a lot of it himself. I mean, and like I said, that was just a handful of quotes. I mean, that's like a 30-page thing that I pieced together. I mean, there's tons and tons more. I mean, basically everything in there, from the planning to the behaviorism to the psychedelics to the eugenics, it's all something that he either espoused or, promoted, or was hanging out with people that were doing it, or was involved in it himself. So I mean,
what's
all
really,
that together.
Yeah. What's really strange about him is I think he ended his life kind of with a Hinduistic worldview, like of reincarnation and the caste system, which is really curious considering the arc of his life, like as an intellectual and stuff like that. But
the term soma is actually, I mean, it's a term for a muscle relaxer that they have, but it's a Sanskrit word. Like the first reference to soma it was basically it's in the Vedas. It was nobody knows exactly what kind of drug it was, but it was some sort of a drug. And I believe he referred to his psychedelics as moksha medicine. And moksha is this idea in the Hindu religion where basically you lose, through meditation, you basically lose your ego, you lose your individual identity, and you sort of, the analogy is like you're a jar of water in the ocean, and you basically dump the water out into the ocean, and that's moksha. You become one with the divine, or, in the novel, the greater being, right? Which again ties us back into, he died, he dosed himself right at the end of his life. Now, I don't know if he dosed himself to death or he knew he was dying and dosed himself, but he took a larger quantity of LSD on his way out.
I think that he knew. I think he was diagnosed with throat cancer in 60, died in 63, November 22nd, 63. So I think he had a sense that the end was on its way. So, but yeah, I mean, he actually coined the term psychedelic. That comes from Huxley. So we're still using these terms that he invented today, doors of perception, all that stuff. Anyway, John Klyczek, thank you so much for your time. Excellent talk. Really appreciate it. Keep in touch. Yes, I will upload this right now. Thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, man.
All right, stay there.